welcome to another episode of All Opinions Welcome. Now, we pride ourselves on getting outside of the echo chamber. And today, our guest, Michael Walker, is certainly in that camp. He's a member of Novara Media, calls himself a class struggle social democrat. And it's fair to say he's a pretty big fan of Jeremy Corbyn. Hello, sir.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
No problem at all. So, Michael, what is a class struggle social democrat?
So, well, a social democrat is the idea that we should have a mixed market economy whereby the state provides some things, the NHS, schools, and also there's lots of investment because you realise that markets don't work very well on their own, so state investment. The class war part is to say that this is only sustainable, this can only last and this can only benefit ordinary people if you have a powerful working class. So how this differs from, say, Tony Blair and what's called the third way is theirs was a very top-down version of social democracy. They weren't that interested in empowering trade unions. So why I've added class war to the beginning of social democrat or class struggle is the idea that we need, as the left, to actively be building a strong working class, be that in trade unions or be that through involvement in Parliament and the Labour Party, essentially.
Do you honestly think that the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, still represents the working classes?
Yes. Yeah. So I think what you're intimating towards there is this idea that it's the Brexit Party that represent the working class.
The vote would seem to appear
so I think what that misunderstands is what class means in the 21st century. So if you're looking at class in terms of levels of income, if you're looking at class in terms of the amount of property you hold, then those people massively, to a disproportionate degree, support the Labour Party. And it's only the Labour Party who has policies which will benefit workers, and it's only the Labour Party who will benefit those people who don't have enough property to live off wealth. So absolutely, if you look at the constituencies where there is the highest levels of poverty, they vote Labour.
OK, let's look at some other constituencies. The 60% of Labour seats that voted to leave. Can you explain to me Jeremy Corbyn's position on Brexit? Because I've been asking for 3 years and I'm none the wiser.
Yeah, so Jeremy Corbyn's position on Brexit is there will be a second referendum. There will be two options on the ballot. One will be a fairly soft Brexit and one will be Remain. And then Jeremy Corbyn will stay relatively neutral and promise to implement whichever option the people decide. So
back to my previous point, how does that position in any way represent 60% of Labour seats that voted to leave?
Yeah, well, that's why you'd need a second referendum, because you need an equal mandate to that first referendum if you want to reverse it. The Labour Party's position on Brexit, where that comes from, is an understanding that the reason people voted leave was often for very good reasons and for reasons which the Labour Party and Labour activists have great respect for, which is an understanding that people have been ignored by the political establishment, that people had been ignored by people in Westminster, and while towns and cities across the country were left to rot, were left starved of investment for the last 30 years. It doesn't need to be that way, to say that markets and free markets mean that we have to suffer and tolerate managed decline in different parts of the UK. That is unacceptable to the Labour Party. The difference between the Labour Party and the Brexit Party is we don't think that the ultimate cause of that is the European Union. I also don't think the European Union is going to save these areas from that. I think what's going to save these areas from managed decline is a massive programme of state investment from Westminster and a massive increase in the rights of the working class in trade unions and in the workplace.
Well, I agree with the first part.
And whether or not we stay in the EU is somewhat it's somewhat besides the point. We can do that either within the EU or outside of the EU.
So you're correct. I agree with you entirely that Brexit was, in large part, a response of the working classes who felt politically homeless and ignored for too long.
There's also lots of wealthy people in the Shires.
So how does ignoring the referendum result from a Labour point of view by having Remain or soft leave in any way honour those people, the fact they were abandoned in the first place? You abandoned them again, aren't you?
So politics is in part about persuasion. So as I've explained before, whilst Labour recognised that many of the reasons people voted leave was absolutely valid, justifiable, and indeed for reasons which we are passionate about, that places in Britain had been left behind and starved of investment. Politics is also the art of persuasion, and what we think is, look, we can reverse managed decline across Britain, but it looks like, given what's available, given the options that are here, that we can do that easiest within the EU, or with some sort of soft Brexit. And that is going to be the way that we build a future which works for everyone in Britain.
OK, so we talk about the politics of persuasion. Let's do a bit of role play. So I intend to stand as a PCC in Ashfield, which is a Labour hold. And it's been Labour-like forever, but it's also 70% leave. You're going to knock on a door, a Labour voter answers that door. How are you going to persuade people like that, which is surely key to Labour's political survival? How are you going to convince people like that that soft Brexit or Remain is the only options for them?
Well, I'd say, look, the key issues in this election is that there has been managed decline in your region, in your town, for decades. And the Brexit Party, your party, doesn't have anything to offer you that's going to reverse that. They don't have any practical policies which are going to reverse managed decline. All they have is a somewhat opportunistic position on Brexit. Now, the Labour Party, they are going to offer a second referendum, which might not be your first choice, but you will have the opportunity to vote for a soft Brexit, and it might well win.
But what if they want to leave without a deal? You won't let them do that, right?
Well, if your priority as a voter is to leave without a deal, and you don't care about whether you're backing a party which ultimately fuels racism, which buys into that kind of thing. Nigel Farage, who has stood in front of posters which say Britain is at breaking point.
That was a different political party a few years ago.
But that was your leader, and he has not apologised. So Nigel Farage, the party who will be empowered if Brexit Party do well in this election, he has stood in front of posters that say Britain is at Brexit point because there are people because there are people fleeing Syria and a civil war, people looking for safety. He is also a politician who has been on Fox News repeatedly saying there are no-go zones in London. That's completely patently false, and it is trying to provoke fear about racism and immigration. And the reason he is doing that is because he recognises that there is great anger in this country, and there's great anger about people having been ignored by the establishment and being ignored by elites, especially in the city. What he wants to do is distract people, blame migrants, blame people who are not responsible for the crisis, and that is not something that we want in Britain.
Okay, as you've just brought up immigration, and you'll note that I didn't, Labour Party this week have just announced they intend to end any controls on freedom of movement. Effectively, the United Kingdom will be free for anybody to come into our country. How on earth does that sit with the sentiment across the Midlands, the North, and across Wales, great parts of Britain, where, whether we like it or not, during the last referendum, immigration was a huge talking point, and now you're saying, come to Great Britain, the water's lovely, jump in. Now, how does that sit with public opinion?
So that policy that was passed at the Labour Party was basically saying, let's defend freedom of movement within the European Union. And I think that makes sense because what Labour are basically offering is remaining in the EU or a soft Brexit.
So it's open borders UK?
Well, within the EU, so it would be the system that we've had for the last 40 years, and most people in Labour judge that that has not been a disaster.
But the last Labour manifesto signed up to agreeing with the ending of freedom of movement if we left the European Union. Now you're going a U-turn on that.
Well, so if there's going to be a general election, there will be a different manifesto. And that actually relates to why that motion was passed. Okay, so many Labour Party activists, like myself, believe that in the Brexit campaign, even though, and as I'll say, it was a fair vote, I'm not one of those people who blames it on Russian oligarchs sending dodgy money to anyone.
Good.
I think Brexit represented a real, in a way, bottom-up rebellion against the political establishment. But I think one of the reasons it happened was because one of the reasons it happened in the way that it did, was that people like Nigel Farage had scapegoated migrants and lied to people and said the problems you have, the reason your rent is expensive, the reason your public services are collapsing is because of the immigrant next door. We have an understanding. We have an understanding as Labour. We have an understanding as Labour Party members. No, that the reason your public services are collapsing and the reason your rent is too high is because the City of London, because the bankers have too much power. And Labour Party members, they want permission to go out on the doorstep and say the problem was not freedom of movement. The problem was the bankers.
So let's analyse that. So if we are importing people per annum, say a city the size of Manchester, in what way does that not place greater strain upon public services, doctors, the NHS? And if Corbyn's latest policy of saying, well, that's just the beginning, please just come anybody in the world, how can that not have an effect on supply and demand of housing, school places? I mean, I'm all ears. I want to hear how that will not affect wages and the provision of public services. It has to. It's logic.
Okay, well, first of all, Labour is not going to have a policy of open borders at the next general election. This is about defending freedom of movement as it's existed in the UK for the past 40 years, and also having a more humane migration policy, because at the moment what we see is things like the hostile environment where migrants are treated in a way which doesn't respect their human rights and doesn't sort of project Britain as the kind of country we want it to be.
I don't know if that's true. How is that true?
Well, I should answer that question as well. Okay, so in terms of is migration inevitably going to put a strain on public services or inevitably push down wages? The answer is absolutely and fundamentally no. And the reason is this. The amount of public services that are available to the British population is not fixed, okay? We can spend more money on the NHS, we can spend more money on social housing, and actually, if we have more migration, which contributes much more in taxes than it takes out, then that will precisely mean we can put more money into the NHS and we can put more money into housing. And in fact, if we were to turn off the tap of migration, it would be our public services that collapse. So this is precisely what I'm saying. The reason the NHS is struggling, the reason people are paying too much rent, isn't because of migration, it's because of political decisions made in Westminster.
It has to be a factor. If we live in a supply and demand world, then more people means less housing means higher rent.
So let's talk about supply and demand.
For example.
So in terms of migration and wages, yes, if you have increased migration, you have more people who are looking for work. That's the supply side. But on the demand side, if you have higher economic growth, which all economists will tell you migration brings, then that will lift the demand. And then if you have a policy whereby you don't disempower workers like Parliament has been passing for the last 30 years and you allow people to organise in trade unions, I'd be in favour of closed shop unions. So anyone who joins a workplace has to be a member of a union. There's no reason why that should lower wages. It's a political decision made here. It's not about your Polish neighbour. It's about the fact that we have had a political establishment in Westminster who has not been willing to put the required money in housing, to put the required money in hospitals, and that's because they won't challenge the interests of bosses and the interests of bankers.
Another thing I'd like to talk about is the proposal to grant voting rights. This was mentioned this week. Voting rights for all existing migrants in the UK and anybody else who would choose to come in the future. Now, call me a cynic, but if we are in a position where Labour has basically hemorrhaged its kind of working class votes across the Midlands, the North and the West, is this a cynical way of reprogramming the electoral base? Come to Britain and vote for Labour. As the Democrats have been accused of in America. Is it
well, as the Democrats have been accused of now. No one is going to migrate to a different country so they can vote for a particular party.
But they would for a free house, NHS care and a vote, immediate citizenship. I mean, it's a pretty tempting and welcoming offer. We're a brilliant country. You can understand why they want to come here.
Well, at the moment, we're not a particularly brilliant country. Not, the numbers who want to come here is dramatically decreasing, partly because people feel less welcome after Brexit, but also because we have crumbling public services. We do have a shortage of housing. Rent is incredibly expensive, whether you're a migrant or not. How would that change if we
invited more migrants? That's the bit I'm struggling to understand.
Basically, what I'm saying is the reason rent is too high, the reason, and I'm paying rent that is way too high. I live in London. Yeah. I live in East London.
We all are.
The reason our hospitals are struggling is because of political decisions about how much money to put into them and to challenge the interests of financial elites. If migrants come or if migrants don't come, we can solve the problems of the NHS. If migrants come, if migrants don't come, we can solve the housing crisis. It's a distraction to be obsessed with migration when the reason that living standards among the working class in this country are stagnating is because of political decisions made by people in Westminster to benefit bosses, not to benefit your Polish neighbour.
Why is it okay for Labour Party members such as David Lammy to call Brexiteers fascists or Nazis, or Diane Abbott to call us racists, whereas this week the Labour Party has been very hung up on words like surrender and humbug? What's the difference?
Okay, so first of all, I think the controversy that's gone on in Parliament and in the public sphere this week isn't so much about words. I don't agree that the particular law that the Tories are calling the Surrender Bill represents a surrender. I think what that is about is constraining a Prime Minister who seems out of control. But I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with calling it a surrender bill if he wants to. And there's obviously nothing wrong with the word humbug. The problem we saw in Parliament was there was MPs, mainly female MPs from the Labour Party, who were standing up and saying, we received death threats. Our friend, our colleague, 3 years ago was shot dead by someone who was shouting, I think it was Britain First, wasn't it? And they are saying they're receiving death threats which contain some of the words that Boris Johnson is using in Parliament. And instead of saying, look, I understand, I feel for you, and I'm putting more money into the police and I will protect every member of Parliament in this House, and I understand how you are feeling. I understand what it must be like to get daily death threats.
I totally agree.
Humbug. I don't care. And to say that to someone who's getting death threats and who is speaking about their friend who was killed 3 years ago is disgraceful. And that should be the controversy.
I totally concur that the heated environment in that place over there should simmer down. But what I'm digging at here is why do we have a seeming hypocrisy and double standards? Why is it okay to call Brexiteers fascists, yet we get hung up on words that are aimed at yourselves? It's almost like, one thing matters and another doesn't. Anyway, just one final point before we go to Bar, which is brilliant. I voted Labour all my life, until very recently. I'm not coming at this as a right winger, and I'm learning tons from you today, so thank you. But I want to finish off by saying there was a Times YouGov poll I saw last week. We said the majority of Labour Party members, not voters, key difference, are ashamed of Britain's history. Why is that? Why does it feel that the modern liberal left is so ashamed of patriotism or ashamed to be British?
Well, I don't think it's about patriotism, and also I'd say it doesn't need to be this way. So something which was spoken about a lot at Labour Party conference, which I was at this weekend, is the idea that we need a Green New Deal. We need to transform our economy to make it to reduce our impact on climate change. And we need to right some of the wrongs that Britain has made in the past. So one of the reasons we are so rich in this country is, yes, because we industrialised first, but because we industrialised first, that meant we were able to exploit countries which industrialised later. We have, in London here, we have benefited greatly from the resources of countries which often haven't been handed over consensually, let's just say. Colonialism was not a consensual process. Brexit Party like to talk about how the fact that we are under the yoke of the European Union. We voted to join. India didn't vote to be colonised by the UK.
We voted to join the single market. That's not the European Union. It's a very different thing.
But in any case, we can go out of it. The situation of Britain in the European Union is very different to the situation of India in the British Empire. They did not choose. And so the left is anti.
So they're two completely different things.
The left is anti-colonialist. No, I'm just saying you should understand the language of colonialism. You should understand the language.
I understand colonialism.
You should understand the language of empire. What we recognise on the left is that
we analyse the bad things and don't celebrate the great things.
Empire was a great injustice. No, Britain has also done some amazing things. But if we want to be proud of our country, and I want to be proud of our country, we should right some of those wrongs. And how we right some of those wrongs is recognise that where a country does need technology to help it develop, where we can support countries to develop green industries, which will benefit us as well, because obviously climate change knows no national borders, we can. But I think we should look at our past not as something which we should necessarily feel sad about or be depressed about, but as a challenge. How can we function as an economy, as a democracy in the 21st century, where we recognise that much of the wealth we have here is the benefit is the result of us behaving in a not particularly responsible or democratic way elsewhere. How can we right those wrongs?
Okay. Well, look, it's been fascinating talking to you, and I think the great thing about these sort of conversations, if we should get out of the echo chamber and actually exchange views, I think this is great.
No, I'm up for it.
So thanks for coming along.
Thanks for inviting me.
Now that was a heated episode. So over to you online. There's plenty to talk about there, but let's keep it clean, because the whole point about this, let that lot over there do the ranting, and lets us be more sober and considered. So over to you across all of our social media platforms. Please join in and see you again next time. Thank you.